These podcasts will deal with the histology of the ear. Now, the ear is an auditory system for sound perception and a vestibular system for balance. And we can talk about the external ear, which receives sound, the middle ear, where sound waves are amplified by ossicles and then transferred to fluid of the inner ear, and then the inner ear itself, which contains vestibular organs for balance and motion, and it contains the cochlea for hearing. Now, there are three divisions to the ear as they relate to the perception of sound, and we'll talk about this in more detail later, but here I'm just giving you a quick overview. Sound waves are collected and transmitted from the external ear to the middle ear, where they're converted into mechanical vibrations by the tympanic membrane and by the ossicles. At the oval window, mechanical vibrations are converted into fluid vibrations within the middle ear, and the fluid vibrations are going to cause displacement of a structure called the basilar membrane. The basilar membrane sits below auditory sensory hair cells, and its displacement stimulates the hair cells, which discharge nerve impulses. Now, I'm not going to make a big deal about that here. You'll talk about it in physiology, but if you note, high frequency sounds are going to cause the narrower portion of this basilar membrane to vibrate, while lower frequency sounds are going to cause the wider portion of this membrane to vibrate. And you'll also notice that the narrower portion happens to be thicker and that the wider portion happens to be thinner. We'll have more about this later. Now, your learning objectives, you should be able to relate histological organization of the ear to functions of balance and hearing. You should be able to describe differences and similarities in the vestibular and hearing regions of the ear, and you should be able to identify the major sensory structures and cell types that are found in the semicircular canals, in the utricle, and in the saccule, and primarily in the cochlea. This is just a diagrammatic view of the ear. You have the auricle with the external acoustic meatus. There's the middle ear, which contains the ossicles, and then the inner ear, which is highlighted here in the bony labyrinth, and then there are, of course, various regions to this inner ear. There's the semicircular canals, the vestibule, and the cochlea, and the diagram here also shows the internal acoustic meatus. You remember that the term meatus means opening, and the external acoustic meatus is just an air-filled channel. The internal acoustic meatus is where the vestibular cochlear nerve passes. The external ear has several components. There's the pinna, the external acoustic meatus, and the tympanic membrane. The pinna consists of elastic cartilage overlaid by thin skin, and oftentimes you'll see associated with it the parotid gland. As we said, this is an air-filled space and it functions to localize sound. The external acoustic meatus is an air-filled space. It's supported by elastic cartilage and bone on the inner portions. It, of course, contains the ceruminous glands, which are modified apocrine sweat glands, which secrete earwax. And it functions, obviously, to amplify sound, to help determine the direction of sound, to amplify that sound, and functions to protect the eardrum. And the eardrum is the tympanic membrane that separates the external acoustic meatus from the middle ear. The tympanic membrane is a stratified squamous epithelium on the external surface. The internal surface is a simple squamous or cuboidal epithelium. This epithelium overlies a thin connective tissue which will contain collagen, elastic fibers, and fibrocytes. The middle ear has the ossicles which transmit and amplify sound waves. There are three types. The malleus, also called the hammer, attaches to the tympanic membrane. The incus, or the anvil, is the largest ossicle. It links the malleus to the stapes. The stapes, also called the stirrup, fits to the oval window and it acts as a piston to the cochlear fluid. The middle ear is lined by a simple epithelium, which can be squamous to cuboidal, and there are muscles in the middle ear that affect the movement of the ossicles. The tensor tympani pulls on the malleus and the tympanic membrane, and the stapedius muscle pulls on the stapedius, and that dampens the movement of the oval window. These muscles are actually skeletal muscle, although we don't really have voluntary control of them, and that's a little bit unusual for skeletal muscle. And then, of course, the auditory tube, or the eustachian tube. This is lined by a columnar epithelium. It's essentially a respiratory epithelium. It connects the middle ear to the nasopharynx, and it functions to vent or equalize the pressure in the middle ear. And of course, if this eustachian tube gets clogged, this is especially critical in children, can lead to otitis media. This just shows the bones, malleus, the incus, and the stapes, and here would be the malleus would be attaching to the tympanic membrane, and here the stapes would be attaching at the oval window. The inner ear contains two labyrinthine compartments and three fluid-filled spaces. There's a bony labyrinth and a membranous labyrinth. The bony labyrinth contains perilymph, which is similar to extracellular fluid. It's got a high sodium and a low potassium concentration. And the membranous labyrinth sits within the bony labyrinth. The membranous labyrinth is essentially a sealed balloon. It contains endolymph, so it's similar to intracellular fluid. It's a low sodium, high potassium concentration. There's also an endolymphatic sac associated with the membranous labyrinth, which is involved in the storage and release of endolymph. The membranous labyrinth contains sensory and secretory regions. The vestibular components of the membranous labyrinth are the semicircular canals, the utricle and the sacula. The auditory portions of the membranous labyrinth would be the cochlea with the organ of Corti. Now, there's a specialized structure in the membranous labyrinth called the stria vascularis. This is actually an epithelium that is vascularized. Again, an unusual epithelium because most epithelium is avascular, but the stria vascularis is a vascular epithelium. This synthesizes and secretes endolymph. Now, these labyrinths define three fluid-filled spaces. The endolymphatic space is within the membranous labyrinth, and it approximates intracellular fluid. The perilymphatic space lies between the wall of the bony labyrinth and it is outside the wall of the membranous labyrinth, and this space approximates extracellular fluid. And then the cortilymphatic space lies within the organ of Corti. It contains true extracellular fluid. We'll talk about these spaces a little bit later. So the structures of the bony labyrinth, there are three connected spaces within the temporal bone. There's the semicircular canals that are at right angles to each other. So there's an anterior, a posterior, and a lateral semicircular canal. There's the vestibule within the middle of these structures that contains the utricle and the sacula. And then there's the cochlea, which is a snail shell shaped structure, and in humans this makes about 2 3/4 turns. The membranous labyrinth, as we said, is a sealed balloon within the bony labyrinth, and it contains the sensory structures. And the membranous labyrinth has two components: a vestibular labyrinth, which is for balance, and a cochlear labyrinth, which is for hearing. The vestibular labyrinth contains crista ampullaris, which are in the semicircular canals, and here would be the crista ampullare here. These detect angular acceleration or the turning of the head. And then there are macula, which are in the utricle and saccule. These detect linear movement of the head. And then the organ of Corte, which is in the cochlea, and that detects sound. And this organ of Corte follows the snail shell shape of the cochlea. Here is the membranous labyrinth, shown in pink, within the bony labyrinth. And this is actually a drawing of the left inner ear. Here is another way to look at this. This would be of the right ear, the bony labyrinth. And this is all the bony labyrinth, and it's this hollowed out space. And you can see these hollowed out spaces where the membranous labyrinth would fit. And this bony labyrinth is filled with perilymph. Here is the membranous labyrinth, which would sit within that bony labyrinth. The membranous labyrinth is filled with endolymph, and here are some sensory areas in the membranous labyrinth. So you have the saccule and utricle with maculas that detect position and linear motion, and we'll talk about their association a little bit later with otoliths. There's the semicircular canals and their sensory areas, the crista ampullaris, that are going to detect angular motion, and they're associated with cupula. And then the cochlea with the organ of Corte, which detects sound for hearing, and the organ of Corte is associated with the tectoral membrane. And again, we'll talk about these in a few minutes. And so here would be the membranous labyrinth sitting inside of the bony labyrinth. There are 6 sensory areas of the membranous labyrinth in each ear. There's the crista ampullaris and the semicircular canals. There are actually 3 of these structures. There's the macula of the utricle and saccule. There are actually 2 of those structures. And then there's the organ of Corte associated with the cochlear duct. There's obviously one of those. So these are 6 sensory structures.